Sir, you need to leave right now. The sharp voice cut through the refined air of Maison Deluxe, a high-end restaurant in the heart of Los Angeles. This place is not for people like you. The waitress, Claire, stood in front of a towering figure, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of irritation and disdain. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze. Shaquille O'Neal, the man who had once dominated the NBA, now found himself the center of a very different kind of attention. Murmurs rippled through the dining hall, eyes darting toward the scene unfolding near the entrance. A few customers whispered in hushed voices, while others simply stared, unsure whether they should intervene or just enjoy the spectacle. Shaq remained still. His face, usually warm and full of humor, was unreadable. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, looking at Claire with the kind of calm that only someone with unshakable confidence could have. And then, everything rewound to the moment he first stepped through the restaurant doors. It had been a long day, and he had come here for one reason, to enjoy a quiet meal. The kind where he didn't have to be Shaq, the celebrity, the businessman, the legend. Just a man sitting down to eat. The entrance to Maison Deluxe gleamed with understated opulence, the kind of wealth that didn't need to scream but whispered exclusivity in every detail. A valet in a crisp uniform had eyed Shaq curiously as he stepped out of his black SUV, dressed in a simple hoodie, loose-fitting joggers, and well-worn sneakers. Inside, the restaurant was a world of muted golds and deep mahogany. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over perfectly arranged tables, where diners sat in elegant silence, absorbed in their meals. The air was thick with the scent of truffle butter and aged wine, a space meticulously designed to cater to those who prided themselves on belonging. Shaq walked in, his presence undeniable. Heads turned, but not out of recognition. Here, he was not the dominant force on a basketball court, nor the face of countless endorsement deals. He was simply an outlier in a place where appearances mattered. Claire, standing behind the hostess podium, noticed him immediately. A flicker of distaste crossed her face, subtle but unmistakable. She took in the casual attire, the sneakers that had seen better days. He didn't belong. She smoothed her uniform, straightened her posture, and stepped forward with a kind of practiced politeness that barely concealed the judgment beneath. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice clipped. "May I help you?" Shaq smiled, his deep voice warm yet measured. "I'd like a table for one." Claire hesitated, her eyes scanning the dining room as if searching for an excuse. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked tonight." Allah. Shaq knew it, and so did a few nearby diners who glanced at the half-empty restaurant. He didn't react, only nodded slightly. "That's so." Claire tilted her chin up, mistaking his calm for hesitation. "Yes, unfortunately. Maison Deluxe has a strict reservation policy. We cater to a certain clientele," and she let the sentence hang, allowing the implication to settle. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had been in situations like this before, places where his fame meant nothing, where assumptions about who he was dictated how he was treated. It never surprised him, but it always revealed something about people. He shifted his stance slightly. "All right," he said, his tone unreadable. "I'll wait for an opening." Claire frowned, her carefully maintained facade slipping for a fraction of a second. She hadn't expected him to stay. Another voice entered the conversation. "Excuse me," a man in an expensive suit said, his tone laced with amusement. "I couldn't help but overhear. I have a reservation for two, but my guest canceled. Perhaps the gentleman could join me." Shaq turned slightly, meeting the man's gaze. There was curiosity there, but not condescension. An offer extended not out of pity, but intrigue. Claire stiffened. The man was William Carter, a well-known investor and frequent patron of Maison Deluxe. Denying his request would be far more difficult. She forced a smile. "Of course, Mr. Carter. Right this way." She turned sharply, leading them through the dining room with deliberate strides. Shaq followed, unfazed by the subtle glares and hushed murmurs that trailed behind them. They arrived at a prime table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the cityscape bathed in golden light. Claire gestured stiffly. "This should be acceptable," she said, barely masking her irritation. Shaq pulled out the chair and sat down, his movements slow, deliberate. He looked up at her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Perfect." Claire's jaw tightened. She had lost the first round, but she wasn't done yet. She set the menu down with just a bit too much force and folded her hands in front of her. Would you like me to explain the menu? Some of our dishes might not be familiar. William raised an eyebrow at the veiled insult. Shaq, however, merely glanced at the menu before looking back at her. I think I'll manage. Claire held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then turned on her heel and walked away. William chuckled softly. You know she's fuming, right? Shaq shrugged. People show you who they are. You just have to pay attention. William studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Across the restaurant, Claire whispered something to another server, a smirk tugging at her lips. She wasn't finished. As the night went on, the battle had only begun. Claire moved briskly through the restaurant, weaving between tables with the ease of someone who had mastered the art of seamless service. But her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't believe the situation unfolding at table 12. This man, this giant in a hoodie and sneakers, was sitting at one of the best spots in the restaurant. Worse, he was unfazed. He should have been embarrassed. He should have walked out the moment she implied he didn't belong. Instead, he sat there, calm as ever, as if none of it affected him. Her fingers tightened around a tray she held, knuckles whitening. She prided herself on maintaining the exclusivity of Maison de Luxe. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was an institution. A place where the wealthy, the powerful, and the influential gathered to indulge in curated luxury. Every element, from the imported Italian marble floors to the meticulously plated dishes, was designed to exude refinement. And now that image was at risk because someone had allowed this man to sit among them. She wasn't alone in her thoughts. From the periphery of her vision, she caught the subtle glances from the other tables. An older woman in pearls leaned in to whisper something to her husband. A younger couple at table 6 exchanged looks, their amusement poorly concealed behind thinly veiled smirks. Even the maitre d' had hesitated upon seeing him enter, though he hadn't said anything. It was all so painfully obvious, except to him. Shaq, however, sat with an effortless ease, one arm resting on the table, his posture relaxed yet imposing. His presence alone had shifted the energy in the restaurant, and that irritated Claire more than she cared to admit. She made her way to the service station, exhaling slowly to suppress her growing frustration. Her co-worker, Jake, glanced at her while preparing drinks, his expression cautious. He had been working at Maison de Luxe nearly as long as she had, but unlike her, he didn't carry the same disdain for guests who didn't fit the aesthetic. Everything all right? He asked, carefully placing a glass of Merlot on a tray. Claire scoffed under her breath. You see that guy at 12? Jake barely glanced up. The tall one. Obviously. She crossed her arms. I tried to get him to leave, but Carter swooped in and gave him a seat. Now I have to deal with him all night. Jake finally looked up, studying her for a moment before returning to his task. What exactly is the problem? Claire let out a dry laugh. Jake, come on. Look at him. Does he look like someone who should be dining here? Jake sighed. Claire, the man is sitting quietly at his table. He's not bothering anyone. He's bothering me, she muttered. Jake shook his head. Maybe you should just focus on your job. She didn't respond, choosing instead to grab the tray and walk away. Back at table 12, Shaq was flipping through the menu with the ease of a man accustomed to fine dining. The pages listed ingredients in ways that made simple dishes sound extravagant. Hand-foraged black truffle reduction for what was essentially butter, artisanal microgreens for a garnish that wouldn't even be tasted. He found amusement in the unnecessary pomp, but he wasn't here to criticize. He wanted a meal, nothing more. Claire arrived at his table, her smile tight. Have you decided? Shaq glanced up, his gaze steady. Yeah. I'll have the filet mignon with the truffle demi-glace. She raised an eyebrow. That's one of our most premium dishes. He nodded. I know. Her lips pursed, but she took down the order. And to drink. Water's fine. A small smirk ghosted across her face, though she tried to hide it. Of course. No wine, no rare vintage, just water. It fit her expectations. I'll put that in, she said, spinning on her heel before he could say anything more. As she walked away, she felt a small sense of satisfaction. He could sit here all he wanted, but he'd never blend in. He didn't know the culture, the silent rules of a place like this. But as the evening wore on, something strange began to happen. The diners, who had been casting subtle glances in Shaq's direction, began to take real notice, not just because of him, but because of the way Claire treated him. Her interactions, laced with veiled condescension, didn't go unnoticed. At table 7, a woman named Lisa leaned slightly toward her husband. "She's being rude," she murmured. Her husband, Tom, barely looked up from his steak. "Who?" Lisa gestured subtly with her fork. "The waitress." To the guy in the hoodie, Tom finally glanced over, his brows furrowing. He hadn't paid much attention before, but now that Lisa pointed it out, he saw it. The way Claire spoke to him, her body language, dismissive, cold, patronizing. It was clear she wanted him gone. "He doesn't seem to care," Tom noted. Lisa observed Shaq for a moment longer, then nodded. That's what's making it worse for her. Meanwhile, at a table near the bar, an elderly man named William Carter, one of the longest-standing patrons of the restaurant, watched the scene unfold with quiet interest. He had seen many things in this establishment over the years, but rarely had he seen such open disdain toward a guest. He sipped his wine, his eyes lingering on Claire. She didn't realize what she was doing. Or perhaps worse, she did, and she didn't think it mattered. Shaq, for his part, continued as if nothing was wrong. He didn't need to justify himself. He didn't need to argue or demand better service. He had faced worse in his life than a snooty waitress in a fancy restaurant. But there was something Claire didn't know. The night was far from over, and before it ended, everything was about to change. The tension in Maison Deluxe was thick enough to be cut with a knife. Though the restaurant remained a picture of sophistication, soft candlelight flickering against polished glass, quiet murmurs of conversation flowing between tables, there was now an unspoken awareness among the guests. Something was happening, something just beneath the surface, and it had everything to do with the quiet giant seated at table 12. Shaquille O'Neal continued to sit with an air of unshakable composure, his broad shoulders relaxed, his face unreadable as he scrolled through his phone. It was a casual gesture, but it only seemed to infuriate Claire more. He was acting as if nothing was wrong, as if he wasn't aware of the disdain laced through every word she spoke to him, as if he hadn't noticed the way she deliberately avoided eye contact when she placed his order, or the way she exaggerated her politeness toward other guests just to make her contempt for him more obvious. It grated on her nerves. Claire prided herself on control. Her job wasn't just about serving, it was about maintaining an atmosphere, ensuring that every person who stepped into Maison Deluxe felt the weight of its exclusivity. And here was a man who refused to be made to feel out of place, who sat with a kind of self-assurance that made her feel as though she were the one being tested. She didn't like that feeling. She made a point of ignoring him as long as possible. When she passed by table 12, she focused her attention elsewhere, refilling wine glasses with practiced grace, exchanging pleasantries with patrons who she deemed more fitting of the restaurant status. She even spent an extra 5 minutes at table 5, entertaining a conversation with a businessman who loved to hear himself talk, just so she wouldn't have to check on Shaq. And yet, despite her efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control of the situation. The glances from other guests were becoming more frequent. A quiet tension had settled into the air, subtle but undeniable. Lisa and Tom, the couple at table 7, continued to exchange looks, occasionally whispering to one another. William Carter, ever the observer, had barely touched his drink, his eyes fixed on Claire with a gaze that felt entirely too knowing. Even Jake had noticed. He had stopped her near the bar, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You know people are watching you, right?" Claire stiffened. "Excuse me?" Jake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm saying you're making this obvious. You think he doesn't belong here, fine, but the way you're treating him. Other people are noticing." Claire forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Jake didn't push, but he gave her a look that made it clear he wasn't convinced. Still, Claire convinced herself that as long as Shaq didn't call her out, she was in control. As long as he sat there, silent and unbothered, she could pretend that she was the one dictating how the night would go. Then his food arrived. The filet mignon, plated with the meticulous precision Maison Deluxe was known for, was placed in front of him by a different server, one Claire had deliberately sent in her place. She had wanted to avoid serving him personally, a final petty act of defiance. And yet, as she turned to walk away, she heard something that stopped her in her tracks. "Excuse me." Shaq's voice was low, steady. He hadn't spoken to her directly since he placed his order, and the sudden sound of his deep timbre sent an unwelcome chill down her spine. She turned slowly. Yes. Shaq gestured toward the plate. Would you mind explaining the dish to me? Her fingers curled into her palm. She knew what he was doing. It was a test, a way to force her to engage, to see if she would treat him the way she treated every other guest. For the first time that night, she hesitated. Her instinct was to be curt, to brush him off. But the weight of the dining room's collective attention settled heavily on her shoulders. She could feel it, eyes watching, waiting. So she forced a smile, one that barely touched her eyes, and launched into an explanation. This is our signature filet mignon, dry-aged for 28 days, cooked to a perfect medium rare, and topped with a black truffle demi-glace. It's paired with hand-harvested microgreens and Yukon Gold potato puree. Shaq nodded, his expression giving nothing away. Sounds great. Then, with deliberate ease, he picked up his knife and fork and began to eat. Claire remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, as if expecting him to say something else, to give her some sort of reaction. But he didn't. Instead, he simply enjoyed his meal, as if she were nothing more than background noise. The realization made her chest tighten. She turned abruptly and walked away, her pulse pounding in her ears. For the first time that evening, it occurred to her that she had been wrong about one very important thing. She wasn't the one in control. Not anymore. Claire moved quickly, retreating toward the bar as if physical distance could somehow erase the exchange that had just occurred. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out the soft clink of glassware and the low hum of conversation. She had been certain that Shaq would either rise to the bait or brush off her thinly veiled insult, but instead, he had done something far worse. He ignored her attempt entirely. She had expected indignation, frustration, maybe even a mild protest. But the way he had simply taken her words, processed them, and continued without reaction left her rattled in a way she hadn't anticipated. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply existed, as if her opinion of him held no significance. That was the part she couldn't stand. She reached the bar, gripping the edge of the polished counter with more force than necessary. Jake, who had been wiping down a glass, glanced up at her, immediately noticing the tightness in her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Claire exhaled sharply, forcing a quick nod. "Fine." Jake's eyes flicked toward table 12, where Shaq continued eating, calm as ever. "You sure?" "Because it looks like." "I said I'm fine," she snapped, a little too quickly. Jake held up a hand in surrender, but didn't look convinced. He set the glass down and leaned slightly closer. "Look, I know you like to keep things a certain way, but you're losing this one." Claire narrowed her eyes. "Losing what, exactly?" Jake gestured subtly toward the dining room. "You feel that shift, don't you? People are paying attention. The more you keep this up, the more obvious it gets." Claire's jaw clenched. Of course, she had felt it. She wasn't blind. The whispers, the glances, the silent but palpable awareness that had begun settling over the restaurant like a thick fog, it was impossible to ignore. At table 7, Lisa and Tom were no longer just exchanging glances. Now they were openly watching, their expressions unreadable. Further back, William Carter swirled the wine in his glass, studying the scene with quiet amusement. Even the maitre d', who usually remained impartial to anything beneath his station, had begun casting occasional looks toward Claire. They were waiting, not for Shaq's reaction, but for hers. That realization sent a fresh wave of irritation curling through her stomach. Jake, sensing her growing frustration, sighed and turned back to his work. Just think about it. Claire forced herself to take a steadying breath. She couldn't let this unravel further. If she lost control, if she let this situation dictate her actions instead of the other way around, she would be the one who looked unprofessional. And she refused to let that happen. Squaring her shoulders, she turned and strode back into the dining area, slipping seamlessly into her usual routine. She attended to table 9, refilled glasses at table 3, and even forced herself into light conversation with a particularly demanding couple at the far end of the room. Anything to reassert her authority over the space. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, she couldn't shake the weight of table 12. Shaq remained steady, composed, utterly unaffected. He didn't seek attention, nor did he try to defend himself. He simply existed in his own space, completely undisturbed by the silent storm brewing around him. It was infuriating. She found herself glancing toward him more often than she intended, and each time she was met with the same unbothered energy, the same effortless confidence that somehow made her feel small. She told herself she was imagining it. But then something happened that made her stomach drop. It started as a low murmur, barely noticeable at first. A ripple of movement in the restaurant, a subtle shift in the air. Then the whispers grew. Claire followed the source of the change, her gaze landing on the entrance just as the doors swung open. Matthew Carter, the restaurant's general manager, had arrived. A man of precision and efficiency, Matthew was not one for unnecessary theatrics. He ran Maison de Luxe like a well-oiled machine, and disruptions, no matter how small, were rarely tolerated. The moment Claire saw him, she knew. He wasn't here for a casual check-in. He was here because someone had told him what was happening. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her face neutral as he crossed the restaurant with deliberate steps. He was scanning the room, his sharp eyes taking everything in. The atmosphere, the tension, the way certain guests were still watching Table 12 with barely concealed curiosity. And then he saw Shaq. His expression didn't change, but there was a brief flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, perhaps even something close to disbelief. He stopped for a fraction of a second, as if processing the scene in front of him. Then his gaze shifted to her. Claire's stomach twisted into a tight knot. She had been in this business long enough to know when someone was about to be held accountable. And this time, she was the one in the spotlight. Matthew didn't immediately approach. Instead, he turned toward the maitre d', exchanging a few quiet words. Whatever was said made the older man nod, his expression carefully composed. Then, and only then, did Matthew start walking toward her. Claire straightened instinctively, forcing a pleasant, professional smile onto her face. But inside, her thoughts were racing. She had played this situation carefully. At least she had thought she had. She had never explicitly denied Shaq's service. She hadn't raised her voice or caused a scene. But it was clear now that the subtleties of her actions had been enough for people to take notice. Enough for Matthew to be called in. Her mind scrambled for a way out. A justification. An explanation that would make this look like anything other than what it was. But as Matthew reached her, his expression unreadable, she realized something. No amount of justification would change the fact that she had been wrong. And now she was about to face the consequences. Matthew Carter had the kind of presence that commanded attention without needing to raise his voice. His reputation at Maison de Luxe was built on precision, professionalism, and an unwavering demand for excellence. He was not known for emotional reactions or unnecessary confrontations, but when he stepped onto the restaurant floor with his eyes locked on Claire, the message was clear. He knew something was wrong. Claire could feel the weight of his approach before she even turned to face him. She had spent years perfecting the art of controlling a room, of making people feel small under the guise of refined politeness. And yet, as Matthew closed the distance, a strange sensation crept into her chest, one she didn't want to acknowledge. Unease. She had convinced herself that whatever had transpired between her and Shaq had been subtle enough to go unnoticed by management. But now, as Matthew's polished shoes stopped just inches from her, she realized how mistaken she had been. The dining room was quieter now. Conversations continued, but there was a noticeable shift in energy. Some guests, though pretending to focus on their meals, stole glances at the two of them. Others were more blatant. Lisa and Tom, for instance, had stopped speaking altogether, their attention fully on the unfolding moment. Matthew didn't look at them. He didn't need to. His gaze remained fixed on Claire, assessing her, reading her. "Come with me." His voice was measured, steady, but it left no room for argument. Claire hesitated only for a fraction of a second before nodding and following him. He led her through the restaurant with deliberate steps, past elegantly set tables, past the kitchen doors where the hum of culinary precision continued uninterrupted, and finally into his private office. The door closed behind them with a soft but decisive click. The air was heavier here, removed from the refined ambience of the dining floor. The walls, lined with sleek shelving and framed accolades, reflected the restaurant's prestigious standing. A large dark wood desk sat at the center of the space, but Matthew didn't sit. Instead, he turned to face Claire, his sharp eyes never leaving her. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, pressing down on her shoulders with a kind of intensity that made her feel for the first time in a long time small. You want to tell me what happened out there? His tone wasn't accusatory. Claire had two choices. She could try to defend herself, spin a version of events that justified her behavior, or she could downplay everything, act as if it had all been blown out of proportion. She chose the latter. I don't know what you mean. She kept her voice level, careful. I was just doing my job. Matthew's expression didn't change. He let the words settle for a moment before responding. Your job. He repeated the words, as if testing them. So your job includes intentionally disregarding a guest, seating him in an undesirable spot, and making it clear he's unwelcome? Claire stiffened. That's not. Claire, Matthew interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying a weight that made her stop. I watched the entire thing. And so did half the restaurant. Her stomach twisted. She had underestimated how many people had noticed. She had been so focused on asserting control over the situation that she hadn't realized how visible it had become. Matthew exhaled through his nose, crossing his arms. You know, we've worked together for a long time. I've seen you handle difficult guests, high-pressure nights. But tonight, what I saw wasn't professionalism. It was something else entirely. Claire's fingers curled at her sides. I didn't do anything wrong. Then tell me why you treated that man differently than anyone else who walked through those doors. Her mouth opened, but no words came, because there was no justification. Not one that wouldn't make her sound exactly like the kind of person she had spent years pretending she wasn't. She hadn't treated Shaq poorly because of his behavior. He had been polite, composed, unproblematic. She hadn't treated him poorly because he had done anything to deserve it. She had treated him poorly because she had assumed. And now, as Matthew studied her, waiting for a response she couldn't give, the realization settled like a stone in her gut. You understand why this is a problem, don't you? His voice was softer now, but no less firm. Claire swallowed hard. She could still salvage this. She could apologize, say it had been a misunderstanding, that she had been overwhelmed, distracted, anything to shift the narrative. But before she could formulate a response, there was a knock at the door. Matthew turned slightly. Come in. The door opened, and Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. Shaq stepped inside. The room seemed to shrink around him, his sheer presence filling the space effortlessly. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, steady, unwavering, landed on Claire for a single piercing moment before shifting to Matthew. Claire's pulse pounded in her ears. This was it. She had spent the entire evening trying to make Shaquille O'Neal feel small, and now standing in the same room as him, she had never felt smaller in her entire life. The room felt smaller now, compressed by the silent weight of unspoken truths. Claire stood rigid, her pulse hammering beneath her skin as Shaquille O'Neal stepped fully into the office. The door eased shut behind him, sealing them inside with the quiet intensity of something inevitable. Matthew Carter remained poised, his expression unreadable, but Claire could feel the shift in his posture. This wasn't just a meeting anymore. This was judgment. Shaq didn't sit. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to anchor the room, his stature a quiet reminder that whatever illusion of control Claire had clung to was slipping fast. He wasn't angry. He hadn't raised his voice once throughout the entire night. And yet, somehow, that made everything worse. Claire's mind worked in overdrive, searching for an out, an explanation, something she could say that would make this moment less unbearable. But nothing came. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until finally, Matthew broke it. Shaq, he said, his tone carefully neutral, though Claire could detect the undercurrent of unease beneath it. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Shaq nodded slightly, his gaze never once flickering toward Claire. Didn't come here to make a scene. His voice was deep, steady, each syllable deliberate. Came here to eat. That's all. The simplicity of the statement sent a sharp, unexpected pang through Claire's chest. It should have been nothing, a mundane, obvious fact, but the way he said it, the weight behind the words, made it feel like something far heavier. She had spent the evening convincing herself that she had been right, that she had been maintaining the integrity of the restaurant, upholding its standards. But standing here now, with the sheer absurdity of the situation pressing in on all sides, she realized the truth. She had denied a man dignity over nothing. Matthew exhaled through his nose, his fingers steepled against the edge of his desk. Claire, he said, finally shifting his attention to her, is there anything you'd like to say? It wasn't a question. Not really. Claire swallowed, the weight of every unspoken judgment pressing down on her like an iron brand. Apologize. The word echoed in her mind, but it stuck in her throat, thick and unmoving. She had never been the type to back down. Her entire career had been built on confidence, on the ability to control a room, to dictate the flow of an interaction. And yet, for the first time in years, she had lost control completely. Shaq finally turned his head, meeting her gaze for the first time since entering the room. His eyes were calm, unshaken, but there was something beneath the surface, something that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of an open chasm. You thought I didn't belong here. His voice was quiet, but the truth in it rang like a hammer against steel. Didn't even know who I was. Didn't matter to you. Claire's lips parted, but no sound came out. Because he was right. She had assumed. That was the worst part of it. She had looked at him and seen only what she had expected to see. She hadn't asked his name. She hadn't treated him like any other guest. She had made a decision before he ever had the chance to speak. And now she was standing in front of a man who had spent his entire life proving people wrong. The air in the room was different now, charged with something she didn't know how to name. Shaq wasn't gloating. He wasn't demanding anything from her. He was just waiting for her to acknowledge what she had done. Her throat tightened. She could lie. She could say she had been overwhelmed, that it had been a mistake, a miscommunication. She could spin the situation into something salvageable. But the truth was already in the open, and no amount of words could pull it back. She forced herself to take a slow breath. I was wrong. The words felt foreign leaving her lips, unfamiliar and raw. She wasn't used to admitting fault. But there was no way around it. Shaq studied her for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod, as if accepting the truth for what it was. Matthew shifted slightly, his expression unreadable. We'll talk about this further, he said, his tone firm but controlled. But for now, I think we all understand the situation. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already made his point. Claire, for the first time in her career, had no choice but to listen. The silence in Matthew Carter's office was suffocating. Claire stood motionless, feeling the weight of the moment press into her chest. She had spoken the words, I was wrong, but they felt hollow, like they weren't enough to undo what had already been done. Shaquille O'Neal remained composed, his expression unreadable as he watched her. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no triumphant smirk that would have made it easier for Claire to justify her resentment. Instead, there was nothing, only quiet patience, as if he had seen this play out before. Matthew, standing between them, finally exhaled. His posture remained straight, his hands resting lightly on his desk, but there was tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there earlier. Claire, he said, his voice level, we need to address this, and we need to address it properly. She swallowed, keeping her face neutral. There's nothing to address, she said, though even she didn't believe it. I've already admitted I was wrong. Matthew's brow lifted slightly. And what exactly do you think that means? Claire hated how much that question made her stomach tighten. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell them both that this was being blown out of proportion, that she had only been doing what she thought was best for the restaurant. But she knew, deep down, that it wasn't the truth. The truth was, she had been wrong from the very beginning. She had made an assumption based on appearance. She had treated a guest differently, not because of how he acted, not because of anything he had done, but simply because he didn't fit the mold of who she thought deserved to be here. And now she was standing face to face with the consequences. She could feel her pulse pounding at the base of her throat. She had spent years perfecting the ability to control a situation, to guide conversations exactly where she wanted them to go. But here, in this room, under this man's quiet gaze, she realized something she had never admitted to herself before. She wasn't in control at all. Matthew's voice cut through her thoughts. Claire, I don't just mean apologizing. I mean understanding. Her lips pressed together. Shaq hadn't moved from where he stood, but there was something about him that made her skin feel tight. He wasn't judging her. He wasn't looking at her like she was beneath him. He was just waiting to see if she would do the right thing. And for the first time that night, Claire wasn't sure if she knew how. Matthew leaned forward slightly. Let me make this clear. You don't get to decide who deserves to be treated with respect. You don't get to look at someone and make that call before they've even spoken. That's not how this works. Claire's stomach twisted. It would have been easier if Matthew had raised his voice. If Shaq had snapped at her, humiliated her in front of the restaurant. That she could handle. That she could fight against. But this was worse. This was a lesson she couldn't argue against. The walls of the office felt too close now. She had spent the entire night believing that she was protecting the exclusivity of Maison Deluxe, maintaining the restaurant's image. But in reality, she had only been protecting herself. Protecting the carefully constructed idea that she knew better than the people who walked through those doors. That she had the right to judge, to decide, to dictate who was worthy. But that illusion had shattered the moment Shaq had chosen to remain unfazed by her actions. And she hated how that made her feel. Claire exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to meet Matthew's gaze. What do you want me to do? It wasn't quite surrender, but it was close. Matthew studied her for a moment before speaking. I want you to go back out there and handle this the way you should have from the start. Claire hesitated. That meant walking back onto the restaurant floor. That meant facing the guests who had been watching, the ones who had already started whispering. That meant owning up to what she had done. Her pride screamed against it. But deep down, she knew it was the only way forward. She swallowed hard. Fine. Shaq, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured. Don't do it for me. The words made her freeze. She looked up at him, confused, but he wasn't looking at her like an enemy. His expression wasn't cold, wasn't smug. It was simply honest. And somehow that made it hit even harder. This had never been about him. It had always been about her. And as she turned toward the door, preparing to step back into the restaurant and face the reality she had created, she knew there was no way to walk out of this unchanged. Claire stepped out of Matthew's office with her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The air in the restaurant felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. The conversations at tables carried on, but there was an underlying shift in the atmosphere, an awareness, a silent acknowledgement of what had unfolded. As she moved toward the center of the dining room, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Some guests tried to act as though they weren't watching, but she could feel their attention nonetheless. Others weren't as subtle. Lisa and Tom, the couple at table 7, had their gazes fixed squarely on her. William Carter, ever the silent observer, lifted his wine glass slowly, his expression unreadable. The realization sent a cold ripple down her spine. She had spent years crafting an image of herself, a professional, polished, unwavering presence in one of the most exclusive restaurants in Los Angeles. And yet, tonight, she had lost control of the narrative. Not because of an outburst, not because of a dramatic scene, because a man refused to react the way she had expected him to. Shaquille O'Neal had remained calm, had allowed her to dig her own grave with every choice she made. He had never raised his voice. He had never demanded anything. He had simply let the moment unfold, knowing full well that the weight of her actions would catch up to her eventually. And now it had. She could still feel him behind her, his quiet presence a reminder that this wasn't over. Matthew's words rang in her mind. Handle this the way you should have from the start. But how? How does she walk back from this? She moved on autopilot, reaching for the tray, waiting at the service station. On it was a carefully plated dessert, Maison Deluxe's signature vanilla bean soufflé with caramelized figs, a dish reserved for the most valued guests. Claire exhaled slowly, steadying herself before making her way back to table 12. Shaq had returned to his seat, his expression unreadable as she approached. She placed the plate down carefully, her movements precise, professional. But there was no mistaking the tension in her fingers. For a long moment she didn't speak. And neither did he. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy, loaded with everything that had gone unsaid throughout the night. Finally, Claire found her voice. This is complimentary, she said, her tone quieter than usual, lacking the usual edge of formality she carried with guests. On behalf of the restaurant, Shaq studied the dessert for a moment before looking up at her. His expression didn't change. You don't have to do this, he said simply. Claire's breath caught for a second. She knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about the dessert. She forced herself to meet his gaze. I know. And for the first time that evening, she really did. This wasn't about fixing the situation with a free dish. It wasn't about smoothing things over so that Maison Deluxe could maintain its pristine reputation. It was about the fact that, for the first time in years, she was seeing herself clearly. Shaq nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, before picking up his spoon. Claire turned, stepping away from the table, but the moment stayed with her, lingering in the air long after she had left. At table 7, Lisa leaned toward Tom. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Tom nodded slowly. "I think everyone did." And just like that, the night shifted. Claire moved away from table 12 with measured steps, though her mind was far from steady. The weight of the moment pressed against her, forcing her to acknowledge something she had spent years avoiding: accountability. She had thought that control was about maintaining power, about shaping a situation to fit within the boundaries she deemed acceptable. But tonight, control had been taken from her in the simplest way possible, by a man who refused to engage in a battle she had started. Shaquille O'Neal had given her nothing to fight against. No anger, no frustration, no outbursts. And in doing so, he had exposed every flaw in the way she operated. Claire had been in the service industry long enough to know that power came in many forms. Some guests threw money around to assert dominance, demanding attention and exclusivity. Others used intimidation, making sure that their presence felt like a threat. But Shaq? He had done neither. He had simply existed. And that had been enough to unravel everything. She returned to the service station, gripping the edge of the polished counter to steady herself. The hum of conversation in the restaurant had resumed, but she could still feel the lingering energy in the air. People were watching, even if they pretended not to be. Jake was the first to approach her. He set down an empty tray, studying her with an expression that wasn't quite smug, but wasn't entirely neutral either. "Well," he said after a moment, "that was something." Claire exhaled sharply. "I don't want to talk about it." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, but you're going to." He lowered his voice slightly. "Look, Claire, I've worked with you for years. You're good at what you do. Really good. But tonight, you lost. And you know it." Claire's jaw tightened. "Why do you care?" she asked, though the words lacked their usual sharpness. Jake shrugged. "Because I think deep down, you're not as bad as you pretend to be." She let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You don't know me as well as you think." Jake studied her for a moment, then simply said, "Maybe." Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward table 12 again. Shaq was still seated, finishing his dessert, completely unbothered by the night's events. That, more than anything else, made something inside her shift. She had spent years believing that people needed to earn their place in a space like this. That exclusivity meant something. But now, watching a man who had every right to demand better, yet chose to sit in quiet dignity, she realized how flawed that thinking had been. Exclusivity wasn't about class. It was about who we chose to welcome and who we pushed away. The bitter truth settled in her stomach. Tonight, she had been the one who didn't belong. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. Then, for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to change.